Welcome to Insight, today produced in collaboration with KCOS 13 El Paso Public Television. Today we are chatting with Linda Velarde, Executive Director of El Paso Via Maria. Linda has generously agreed to share some of her experience with us. I'd like to thank you, Linda, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Via Maria is such an interesting organization and very unusual. You are the only shelter for single women in the entire region.
Yeah, here in El Paso we are. There's been a couple of other shelters that have had to close their doors due to funding cuts, and so now we are the only. We fill a certain niche in El Paso, and that's single women whose children aren't with them.
So how do women come to you? What shape are they in? What have they just recently experienced that caused them to come to your shelter?
Well, they come from different places. They're often referred to us by judges, by some drug diversion programs. They'll come through us that way. They'll be coming straight out of prison or through rehabilitation facilities. When women who have some types of substance abuse problems, we want them steeped into a path before they get to us. But they do often come in crisis, and what we try to do is stabilize them and get them through the facility and transition them into self-sufficiency.
Talk about your different programs. In addition to just providing a safe place, talk about how you help these women make that transition from the moment they walk into your doors.
Okay, so we have a really beautiful shelter here in Segundo Barrio, and the building has been there for a long time, and we are capable of having 22 women at a time. And each woman has their own room and their own bathroom. It's a very loving and warm environment. It feels like a home, not a shelter. And I also have a caseworker who works intensely with each woman. And she knows everything about each woman that comes through that door. And the two of them figure out what their problems are, what their issues are, what brought them to Via Maria. Why are they homeless, and why are they having the problems that they're having? And then they figure out a plan, and how to get them to a point where they can be self-sufficient. And that could be, for each woman it's different. It's obviously depending on what her issue is. So for instance, if you have someone who comes in with substance abuse problems, it's important for her to either be going to AA or NA meetings. We have those at the shelter, but we make sure that they are going to their meetings. Some of them who come from those issues are on probation or parole. They've come out of prison because of it.
And they need to report back on a regular basis,
mm-hmm.
and there are certain behavioral restrictions that are part of that parole.
Yeah, we're a transitional living center. It's kind of like a halfway house. We have rules. We have curfews. Several of them have to abide by that, depending again on their situation. And they got to be back at 6, in the afternoon or in the evening for dinner. And there's freedom there, but there's not. It's a program. We've got a program for them, and if they're ready to move on in their lives and turn, the leaf over, we're there for them.
And this is an important concept. It's a voluntary reeducation center. So when you come in and you agree to receive these services, you also are creating an agreement with Via Maria.
Correct. Right.
That you will do your best to shift some of those behaviors that have not been productive in your own life.
Right. Yeah, and they've got to be willing to do it. And, most of the women that go through it are pretty successful. They leave Via Maria with some type of income and affordable housing to go to, and, something to do. We don't have women there sitting idle. We make sure that if they need to go to, see the psychiatrist, that they have access to that. If they need a GED class, so that they can pass the GED, we make sure that happens. If they need dental work, we find dentists for them. And we do whatever it is that they need to get them through Via Maria and back on their feet.
So you serve 22 women at any one time. How many women do you serve annually?
So this last funding year, we did 57 women.
Mm-hmm.
We've been around 10 years now, so we've had over 500 women come through our facility. To me, that's a staggering number. And, I would say that our success rate is probably about 75 to 80%.
And for those women for whom you have not been successful, what happens with them? Do they come back through your program, or
some do?
How do you follow them?
Well, we do some checks on them, but it's difficult to keep after the women who've graduated. We've got to work on the women that are there.
Right.
And we have had some that have come back through our facility. Some of those women who were not successful with have maybe mental health care concerns that in many cases that's a very difficult issue to treat and to work with. And oftentimes those are the women that you'll see in emergency shelters where however hard you try, you can only get there to a certain point. And so those are probably a large amount of the women who are not successful. The other ones are the victims of domestic violence, because there's a very big cycle, a very hard cycle to break. And especially when you have a woman who's not educated, who's never worked, has lots of children, the security is in her home, and for them to have the courage to leave that and to think that they could do it on their own, it's just a huge obstacle. It's really hard. So that's probably another percentage of women that is hard to rehabilitate.
And you're caught in a vice very often between your dependence and the violence that you have to tolerate in order to have some level of security. So it's not a black or white situation. You have your children to think about, and how that is going to function, what is best for the child, what will you tolerate. It is the kind of calculus that is so very difficult. There's no trite answer to it.
No, there isn't, and it's in a case-by-case basis. Each woman is, got a different life, and, different struggles. To me, there's a real important statistic amongst homeless women. I worked for legal aid before I took this job here, and I worked with the homeless community as well. And most of my female clients, I was getting them disability. I was doing administrative work with them. And so I had access to medical records and mental health records. And so for most of the women that I had, probably 95% of those women had been molested at some point in their life.
95% had been molested.
At some point in their life. And I think that's the major source of for homeless women. That's why they're homeless. They have that in their background, and trying to get back into some type of normal world, they've never had it. So, how do you live a normal life when they've been abused and molested, and they seek drugs to
self-medicate.
To self-medicate, or, they become criminals and, thieves and whatever it is to deal with that history and past.
And the tragedy is that sexual violence, ironically, becomes an indoctrination into a particular cycle.
Yes.
That is very difficult to break. You have issues of self-image. You have issues of how your brain chemistry reacts and how you become addicted to certain cycles. And then in your own life, you just repeat and repeat and repeat what you hate about yourself.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself becomes corrosive to moving on.
Right.
And so your programs are really created to start to address so many of these issues.
Yeah, and I believe what Via Maria does differently than some places is that we honor the dignity of each person, no matter where they came from. And we forgive people for the mistakes or whatever it is that brought them there, because, none of us are told how to live life, and
Right.
especially when you're starting at a negative, when you've been abused or, so we honor each woman that comes in, and we try to, empower them, and teach them that they're worth it, just to start, that, it's okay, that they're there now and they're safe, and we love them, and we're ready to, I want them to have what I have in my life. I want every one of them to have that. And so what we do is try to teach them, try to give them those things.
So how does the funding work?
Well, El Paso is a real giving community. I think there was some study last year that said, for as poor as we are here in El Paso, we're one of the most charitable communities in the country.
So what percentage comes from both foundations and individual donors versus government grants?
It's probably a third each, no, a fourth, because we have a real big fundraiser. We had a fundraiser in November, and I think the number I'm looking at is we made about $70,000 from that fundraiser, and it's huge. It's gotten bigger every year. We've had it for almost 9 years now, and it's kind of one of the events in El Paso, which is really nice because we're a really small, little tiny shelter with very quiet presence. But when we have this really fun party every year, and this year was, it's a good source of our income. So I would say it's a fourth. Except now we lost our HUD funding. HUD has been cutting funds to El Paso, to everywhere in the country, I think.
So Housing and Urban Development is cutting funds in support of these poverty programs.
Right. They've switched the proportion from funding services to funding rapid rehousing, which is a model that they're trying to push, and it works, I think, if the service web is in place. Because the idea is to house someone who's homeless immediately and then give them the services.
Right.
So that there's no homeless population.
But what's happening is that the funding is shifting away from services to housing. So what ends up happening is that you start to unbalance this support web, where you have housing but without services, and that can lead to a recidivistic kind of a cycle in which people are housed temporarily, and then they go back into this cycle, which throws them out of housing, which then...
Right. So you'll have a 3-month period of time where you may have the homeless population down because they're in housing, but you go back 3 months later and they're back out on the streets because they haven't been given the tools to, to not be homeless, to learn how, to have a job and to get the medications that they might need to be stabilized. Or to be going to, AA classes or NA classes, or, if those services aren't around, they're going to end up back on the streets.
And this is where change occurs. Velarde, thank you so much for sharing the work of El Paso's Villa Maria, and thank you so much for your insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me.